What would you do if you were turned away? Not because of any mistake, but simply because of how you look. At Sapphire Gate, a well-dressed family stood tall, holding their Crystal Elite tickets and a golden gift for their beloved grandmother. And yet they were stopped cold. Not a single ticket scanned, not a single apology offered. Only a look of disdain and a cold, cutting sentence. Please use another gate. But do you know what made the entire flight grind to a halt? It wasn't shouting. It wasn't an argument. It was just 5 quiet words. I'll make a phone call. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss the powerful stories that just might change how you see the world. Are you ready? Let's begin. The Alexander Pierce family, his wife, Victoria Langley, their son, Julian Carter, and daughter, Scarlett Monroe, arrived at Sapphire Gate carrying their Crystal Elite tickets and a small golden-wrapped gift meant for their grandmother. But the air around them thickened suddenly when Genevieve Clark, the gate attendant, raised her hand to stop them without even scanning the tickets. Little Scarlett clutched the tiny gift tighter, her wide, panicked eyes darting to her mother. Julian instinctively stepped in front of his sister, even though his heart pounded with fear. Victoria leaned down, her voice a tender whisper. "Hold on to the gift, sweetheart." In that moment, Alexander tightened his grip on the bag strap, drawing in a deep breath. This father, instead of raising his voice or exploding in anger, simply uttered 5 quiet words. "I'll make a phone call." An invisible ripple swept through the space, freezing Genevieve mid-motion, then stopping the entire line behind them. Passengers began turning their heads, frowning in confusion. A young staffer rushed off to call a supervisor. The boarding sign's lights flickered off unexpectedly. The atmosphere stretched, swollen like an overfilled balloon, ready to burst. Yet no one knew exactly when. This wasn't just about a denied first-class ticket. This was the moment a family chose to hold on to their dignity in the face of cold, judging eyes. Alexander knew it all too well. He knew every silent second was another second his family endured stares, whispers, and racing heartbeats. But still he stayed calm, choosing a response no one saw coming. Have you ever faced a moment of helplessness like that? A moment where one small action, just a single phone call, became a test of trust, honor, and strength? Don't look away, because right now, a single shift will change not only their fate, but the fate of everyone standing by, watching. Genevieve Clark, the gate attendant at Sapphire Gate, stood with her arms crossed, staring down the Alexander Pierce family without even bothering to scan their tickets. In her eyes, they didn't belong in the Crystal Elite line. Alexander, Victoria, Julian, Scarlett, all impeccably dressed, polite, composed, but somehow that still wasn't enough. Genevieve pressed the pause button and motioned for them to step aside, for verification. Little Scarlett clutched the small golden gift for her grandmother, her eyes shimmering with worry. Teenage Julian stood frozen, his trembling lips pressed together as he lightly placed a protective hand on his sister's shoulder, trying so hard to appear strong. Victoria gently rested her hand on her husband's arm, her gaze silently pleading, "Don't let the kids see us break." And then, an unexpected twist. Alexander didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I'll make a phone call." In that instant, what rebounded wasn't just Genevieve. It was an entire system, a system so used to judging people by appearances alone. The gate's phone rang sharply. A young staffer picked it up, confusion flickering across his face. Tension rippled outward like an invisible crack spreading across glass. The long line of passengers behind them stirred and murmured, "Who could possibly bring boarding to a complete halt with just one phone call?" Genevieve's fingers tightened around her clipboard, her palms damp with sweat. But what left every onlooker breathless was the moment Victoria leaned down and whispered into Scarlett's ear, "If we have to, I'll leave the gift behind. I just want you to make it onto the plane." That quiet sacrifice, that soft, heartbreaking surrender, shattered the audience's heartbeat. From here, the story was no longer about who was right or wrong. It became a brutal reminder. Sometimes it takes just one person at the right moment to crack a system wide open. Are you ready to keep watching? Because right after this, the doors of power swung open, and Genevieve would never forget what happened next. Alexander calmly spoke 5 words. I'll make a phone call. No anger, no sharp tone, just a quiet statement, yet the entire space seemed to freeze. Genevieve Clark's brow twitched slightly, thinking he was merely bluffing. But less than a minute later, the nearby landline rang. A young staffer scrambled to answer, his voice trembling. Yes, sir. I understand. Meanwhile, Victoria gently bent down, brushing Scarlett's hair from her face. If I can't get on the plane with you, will you still be okay? It was a quiet question, the kind only a mother prepared to sacrifice everything could whisper. Scarlett clung tightly to her mother's hand, eyes welling with tears. Julian quietly edged closer, shielding his little sister, knowing he couldn't really protect her, but standing there anyway, because that's what an older brother does. That phone call didn't just shift the situation. It exposed an entire system running on invisible arrogance. Why would a single call bring an entire boarding process to a halt? Who exactly was standing before them? No one knew the answer, but the entire waiting area fell silent, every gaze now fixed on the Pierce family. In that moment, the weight of helplessness no longer sat on the family's shoulders. It flipped back onto Genevieve. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her hands began to shake, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grasp. For perhaps the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't in control of anything. And in that moment, the audience can't help but wonder, when true power walks into the room, who's really the small one? That call rang out, and within minutes, the atmosphere at Sapphire Gate had completely shifted. Firm footsteps echoed down the hallway. Sebastian Cole, the regional director, and Nathaniel Sterling, the ground operations supervisor, arrived without warning. Genevieve Clark stood frozen. Her fingers clutched the clipboard as if it were the last thread of power she had left, but her hand was already trembling. Alexander Pierce remained silent. Victoria gently bent down and whispered to Scarlett, "If anything happens, just hold on tight to my hand, okay?" Julian clenched his fists, jaw tight, but didn't move. It was the kind of moment every child learns their first hard lesson about helplessness. Sometimes silence is all you have. Sebastian approached, his eyes flicking swiftly over the passenger list before landing squarely on Genevieve. "Ms. Clark, have you checked all 4 tickets?" His voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but it was sharp enough to make the entire crowd hold its breath. Genevieve swallowed hard, opening her mouth to speak, but Nathaniel cut in, pointing to the scanner screen flashing a steady green. All tickets valid. Crystal Elite, no one missing, no one wrong. One phone call, just one, and their entire system snapped to attention. But the strongest blow didn't come from the superiors. It came from the way that family stood there. Not angry, not protesting, just waiting. And it was that very waiting that made Genevieve realize something. True power doesn't lie in the loudest voice. It lies in the silence that forces others to confront themselves. Genevieve Clark stood frozen as the command crackled through the radio. "Clark, halt all procedures immediately." Her hand stopped midair, her face stiffening as she watched Sebastian Cole personally check the tickets on the screen. Every single ticket was valid. Crystal Elite, not a single mistake. Alexander Pierce said nothing more. Beside him, Victoria Langley gently wrapped her arms around their 2 children, whispering with a trembling voice, "We're still going, sweetheart. I promise." But little Scarlett had already burst into tears, not out of fear, but from that sharp, aching realization in her chest. At just 8 years old, she was feeling for the first time that adults aren't always fair. Genevieve, once so proud of the badge pinned on her chest, suddenly felt its weight dragging her down. When she was quietly asked to step aside, she moved away, watching as Alexander bent down to pick up the small gift Julian had dropped in the tense moments. A tiny gold-wrapped box, scribbled in shaky handwriting. "For Grandma, from our hearts." That sight pierced straight through Genevieve like a blade. No one raised their voice, no one demanded compensation. All they wanted was to move forward, to hold on to their dignity, to keep a simple promise to their children. And in that moment, Genevieve understood. Sometimes the deepest helplessness doesn't come when others scold you. It comes when you realize on your own that you've touched the raw pain of people who only ever wanted to be treated right. As the Pierce family stepped onto the plane, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Alexander gently placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder, while Scarlett and Julian clutched each other's hands tightly, hugging the small gift that had nearly been lost at the gate. They said nothing. No gloating, no lifted chins to claim victory. They simply walked forward, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened. Yet it was that very silence that echoed the loudest. An elderly passenger by the window unconsciously folded down his newspaper, his quiet gaze following them. A young flight attendant touched the Crystal Elite badge on her name tag, a flicker of unease crossing her eyes. And Genevieve, now asked to step away from her post, stood silently in the background, watching the family disappear into the cabin. In that moment, a memory stirred in Genevieve's mind. A long-ago day when she had once tried to help an elderly passenger who'd been denied boarding, only to be reprimanded by her supervisor for breaking the rules. She wondered, when had she become part of this unfeeling machine? A surge of helplessness welled up inside her, not because anyone had insulted her, not because anyone had thrown harsh words, but because the sheer, undeniable silence forced her to face herself. This wasn't a defeat played out in public. It was a cut deep inside, one that shook her for the first time in years. And at that moment, the audience can't help but wonder, if it were you, how would you feel when finally faced with that truth? Damian Blackwood, the captain of the flight, received a direct order from Everett Sinclair, the highest-ranking executive at the airline. Oversee the entire flight. Full report after landing. Damian gave a subtle nod, his eyes briefly flicking toward Alexander Pierce as the family settled into their Crystal Elite seats. In the cabin, Scarlett pressed close to her mother, clutching the shimmering little gift. Alexander remained silent, his gaze heavy with unspoken meaning. Not a word, not a triumphant glance, just a cold, unmistakable message sent straight through the system. We know you're watching. Behind the counter, Genevieve Clark kept her head bowed as Damien passed by. She could feel the shift in the air. Every footstep, every word, every glance now carried a weight she no longer controlled. In a fleeting moment, Damien turned to a young flight attendant and whispered something. That attendant quickly moved into the cabin, walking up to an elderly passenger, the same man Genevieve had refused to assist earlier, and quietly invited him to switch to a better seat. It was a small act, but to Genevieve, it cut deep, like a silent knife twisting inside. She saw the helplessness within herself, realizing that these quiet, precise gestures needed no explanation, no noise, only the right person giving the word. And at this moment, the audience is surely left wondering, does real power lie in authority or in how one chooses to use it? Genevieve Clark stood frozen in the middle of the aircraft cabin, her face pale as the suspension order crackled softly over the internal radio. A flight attendant gently touched her arm, saying nothing, only motioning for her to step away from the service area. Around her, passengers shifted their gazes, looking anywhere but at her, dodging the suffocating shame now blanketing the entire cabin. Damian Blackwood, the captain, cast a quick glance down the Crystal Elite row. The Pierce family sat there, calm, not a single hint of triumph on their faces. Scarlett still hugged the little gift in her hands. Julian gripped his mother's hand tightly, and Alexander gave Damien a quiet nod, as if sending the message. Let it end here. Then in one brief, unexpected moment, Genevieve did something no one saw coming. Instead of arguing, she pulled her employee badge from her uniform, unpinned her name tag, and placed them neatly on the nearby service tray. Her eyes glistened, not from anger, but because, for the first time in years, she felt utterly exposed. No power, no shield, just herself, laid bare. And the audience watching this unfold can't help but wonder, what cuts deeper, being suspended in front of a crowd or realizing you were wrong when there's no chance left to make it right? No one spoke. The entire plane sat in a heavy, aching silence, broken only by the faint sound of held-back sighs. And it was within that silence that the weight of the lesson began to settle, on each person, one by one. In the first-class cabin, The air remained heavy after the quiet storm that had just swept through. The Crystal Elite passengers, people accustomed to privilege and influence, whispered among themselves. How could just one phone call shift everything so completely? No one had seen Alexander angry. There were no raised voices, no displays of power. Just 5 gentle words, enough to make the entire system tremble. A middle-aged woman, who had earlier caught the worried glance of little Scarlet clutching her gift, now bowed her head, her heart weighed down. She remembered watching Genevieve walk out of the cabin, not in handcuffs, not humiliated with harsh words, but surrounded by a cold, crushing silence. And then, an unexpected moment. A young flight attendant, eyes still red, quietly slipped out of the service galley and gently placed a handkerchief on Genevieve's vacant seat. A small, late gesture of comfort. And in that profound silence, Alexander softly looked at his children, his gaze tender yet firm, as if teaching them a life lesson. You don't need to shout to demand fairness. You only need to know your worth. This wasn't just a moment that choked up the audience. It was a moment that forced every watcher to quietly ask themselves, when you face injustice, how will you respond? With fury, or with a calm so powerful it makes the whole world adjust itself? Genevieve sat alone in the crew compartment, the headset crackling to life with the unmistakable, cold and resolute voice of Everett Sinclair. Genevieve, he spoke slowly, your failure isn't just a breach of procedure. It's that you repeated a bias we've been working hard to dismantle. Her fists clenched tightly, nails digging deep into her palms, her throat tightening painfully. In that moment, it wasn't just Alexander Pierce she remembered. It was the countless passengers she had passed over, quietly judged with a glance, a furrowed brow, a lifted chin. The plane glided silently across the sky. In the Crystal Elite cabin, Alexander gently squeezed little Scarlet's shoulder as she leaned against him, her brown eyes still shimmering with lingering worry. And just beyond the thin metal wall, no one in first class knew that a woman was breaking apart in silence, stripped of every polished shield she'd worn for years. A small but profound moment unfolded. A young flight attendant shyly approached Genevieve, softly placing a glass of water on her trembling hand, whispering, I know you're not a bad person. Just those words, just that, were enough to crack her open, to make Genevieve weep for the first time after years of armoring herself in a hardened shell. This was no longer about procedures. This was about the human heart. And the audience watching can't help but feel that sharp ache inside. Who among us wouldn't be pierced by that? Dominic Hayes from Human Resources stepped quietly into the small back room behind the airport, his eyes carefully avoiding Genevieve Clark's. On the table lay the termination papers, her badge, her access card, her neatly folded uniform, each item stripping away what had defined her for so many years. Genevieve's hands trembled as she picked up the pen, each stroke of her signature unbearably heavy, her mind echoing with one haunting question. One mistake, and I lose everything. Back in the Crystal Elite Lounge, Alexander Pierce bent down to pick up the stuffed bear his daughter had dropped in their rush to board. A small moment, yet one powerful enough to squeeze the audience's heart. While one family preserved their dignity through quiet strength, one woman lost everything because she failed to see one simple truth. The human heart doesn't sit on the surface. No one turned to watch as Genevieve silently walked away, except for one young employee, the very one she had once mentored, who hurried over and handed her an umbrella as the rain began to fall. Genevieve smiled for the first time in years, a real smile, because in losing her title, she had finally begun to find herself. And the audience can't help but ache inside as they realize, sometimes the deepest fall is the very chance to rise and become someone better. Genevieve Clark walked slowly down the Crystal Elite cabin aisle, 2 security staff flanking her on either side, each footstep echoing with a hollow sound that filled the space. No one on board intervened. No one spoke up. There were only eyes following her, not eyes of scorn anymore, but eyes that would remember. An elderly passenger, who had once smiled warmly at her while boarding, now quietly lowered his gaze, avoiding her eyes. Genevieve clenched her fists, her heart trembling. years of standing atop power, and now not a single hand reached out to pull her back. As she passed the Pierce family's seats, her glance flicked involuntarily toward them, and she saw little Scarlett Monroe, clutching her stuffed bear tightly, her small eyes filled with a wordless sorrow. In that instant, Genevieve understood. She wasn't just being removed from a job, she was being cut off from the chance to become someone better. Outside the plane, the rain had begun to fall, cold drops tracing down her cheeks, blending with tears she didn't wipe away. No badge, no uniform. Just a lone woman stepping into the rainy night, carrying a brutal, unforgettable lesson carved into her heart. Power can vanish with a single phone call. But trust takes a lifetime to rebuild. Lillian Windsor, a senior executive, walked slowly down the corridor and stopped before the group of top leaders huddled in an emergency meeting. Her voice dropped low, almost a whisper. The Pierce family isn't suing. They're not asking for compensation. They're letting silence speak for them. That single line pulled the entire room into a heavy, uneasy stillness. Outside the glass doors, Genevieve stood quietly, clutching the envelope containing her termination papers, her eyes stinging. In that moment, her mind flashed back to the image of Alexander bending down to pick up little Scarlett's stuffed bear. A small, tender act no one else had noticed, except her. Outside the airport, rain pounded down, misting the windows with a thin fog. Genevieve placed a hand over her chest and, for the first time, she felt breathless. Not because of losing a job, but because she had lost something deeper, the chance to become a better human being. No one forced her to fix things. No one made her kneel and beg for forgiveness. But it was the very silence from the people she had once judged that became a mirror, forcing her to look straight into herself. Inside Genevieve rose a profound, aching helplessness. Not helplessness against the system, but helplessness against her own heart, which had hardened for far too long. And in that fleeting moment, she knew this was the true beginning. Genevieve left the Topaz parking lot, pulling her old coat tight around her neck, shielding herself from the reporter's eyes. Camera flashes popped. Microphones were shoved close to her face. She heard the hushed voices of strangers she'd never met. Is that her? The one suspended for discrimination? Every step felt like she was dragging lead weights. Inside, it wasn't just the fear of losing her job. It was the searing awareness that she had lost her reputation, the trust others had once placed in her. She remembered that morning, the moment when little Scarlett had turned back to pick up her dropped teddy bear, looking up at her, not with anger, not with blame, but with a child's pure, uncomprehending eyes. Suddenly, Genevieve stopped in the middle of the media swarm. A small, powerless, but piercing moment cracked through the storm of public scrutiny. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her old badge, and quietly set it down on the lid of a trash bin by the sidewalk. No one had asked her to do it. No one had forced her to bow her head. But in that final moment, it was the only way she could hold on to a shred of dignity for herself. Across the street, the glowing Crystal Elite billboard sparkled in the night, untouched, indifferent, uncaring. And Genevieve understood, fully and painfully, to start over, she would have to learn how to exist without being anyone in the eyes of the world. This was the real lesson. Genevieve returned to Ruby Heights, stepping quietly into her small apartment, where her old uniform still hung on the hook. She ran her fingers over the badge that once filled her with pride, a symbol of power, of status, now nothing more than a cold, lifeless piece of metal. She sat down on the bed, her shoes falling to the floor unnoticed. In that moment, memories rushed in. The countless times she had coldly looked at customers, the times she forced a smile, all the while harboring contempt. She realized the power she had once held was never true strength. It was merely a thin mask, ready to shatter when the truth came to light. She sighed deeply, pulling out a small sticky note from her pocket. Not an apology letter to send, but a reminder written for herself. There's no one left to prove anything to. It's just me, facing myself. Outside the window, the Ruby Heights lights flickered, casting reflections on the badge like a searing wound. Genevieve clenched her fist, her eyes brimming with tears, not because she had been fired, not because her reputation had crumbled, but because for the first time in her life, she felt completely bare. And in that moment of helplessness, hope began to spark. If she could fall, she could also rise as someone new. Genevieve sat at the small table in Ruby Heights, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the blank sheet of paper. It was late at night, and the only light coming through the window was the soft yellow glow, casting shadows on the letter she had written, a letter that would never be sent. Dear Pierce family, I do not seek forgiveness. I only wish to acknowledge this. It was your silence that taught me something I have never understood in my entire life. The true strength does not lie in power, in orders, but in restraint, in dignity. She paused, her pen hovering, throat tightening. In that moment, a small memory flooded back. When she was young, standing before her mother, tears in her eyes, longing for her mother's embrace after a mistake. But her mother had turned away, coldly saying, "Stand up. No one needs to hear your apology." Genevieve had grown up carrying that lesson with her, turning it into a wall of steel. Now it was the Pierce family, quiet, without raising their voices, without seeking revenge. That had made that wall crack. She put the pen down, her hand gripping the edge of the paper until it wrinkled. Outside, the world was talking about her, social media was in an uproar, and the company had made its statement. But in the small room, there was only one woman, alone, facing herself. And for the first time she understood, she needed to relearn how to be human. On social media, the image of the Pierce family quietly walking through Sapphire Gate, holding the golden gift, their innocent eyes still unable to comprehend what had just happened, spread like wildfire. The posts erupted. They didn't need to sue. They didn't lower themselves. With silence, they made the world tremble. Genevieve sat silently, staring at her phone screen, where images of her were shared thousands of times. No one defending her, no one remembering the rules she had once prided herself on. A former colleague sent her a message. "I used to admire you, Genevieve, until that day." Her heart clenched. The next footage smoothly transitioned. A reporter asked Alexander, "Do you have anything to say?" Alexander simply shook his head, bent down to pat his son's head, and whispered, "Let everyone understand for themselves." At Ruby Heights, Genevieve dropped her phone onto the table, her hands covering her face. For years, she had believed she was upholding standards, not realizing she had only been maintaining an empty power. Now before her, those symbols, the badge, the uniform, the rule book, seemed faded, insignificant, and the deepest helplessness didn't come from losing her job, losing her reputation, but from realizing it was those very people she had once looked down upon who had taught her the lesson of dignity that she had never learned in her entire life. Genevieve sat alone in her apartment at Ruby Heights, the unsent letter lying before her. Outside the window, the city buzzed with life, while inside she faced the heaviest silence of her life. The letter wasn't just an apology to the Pierce family. It was a confession. She hadn't failed because of a single mistake, but because of a lifetime of arrogance she had never even realized. In her mind, the last conversation from that day echoed, when Alexander had turned away, without a word of reproach, without a glance of contempt. It was that silence that had broken her. A former colleague had once said, "Silence is the one thing you can't fight." Now she truly understood. The scene smoothly shifted to Genevieve walking to her old desk, taking down the badge she had once cherished as a symbol of power. She placed it in a box alongside her uniform and employee ID, her heart heavy. This moment was just as powerful as any fall from grace. And then, in a surprising moment, Genevieve lifted the letter, not tearing it up, not sending it, but holding on to it as a reminder. The emotional climax didn't lie in a public act, but in the deep, quiet helplessness. Realizing that the most important lesson of her life came from the very people she had once judged. The story of the Pierce family didn't end on the Crystal Elite flight. It spread throughout the industry, becoming a warning that no company could afford to ignore. Silent clips, the image of the child clutching the golden gift. The words, "I'll make a phone call," were shared millions of times, sparking heated debates, subtle favoritism, judgment based on appearances. How many more times was this happening unseen? Genevieve sat in the empty conference room at the old headquarters, listening to the industry leader, Lillian Windsor, speak on the livestream. Uniforms, tenure, policies cannot be shields to cover personal biases. We must take responsibility. Genevieve's eyes welled with tears. She wondered, if only she had realized sooner, how many passengers, how many colleagues would have been spared harm. The emotional crescendo came when Genevieve quietly left the building, catching sight of a young girl of color waiting for her parents outside, her eyes full of worry, just like the look she had once ignored at Sapphire Gate. This time Genevieve bowed her head, offering a gentle smile, walking forward, carrying the lesson that had been deeply etched into her heart. True change begins with the courage to look back at ourselves. The script closes with a quiet scene, yet one heavy with emotion. Genevieve stands outside her old headquarters, gazing into the mirror where she once saw herself in her uniform, wearing her badge, proud of the power she held. Now all she sees is a woman facing herself. No more excuses, only the truth. In that moment, no one is shouting, no one is pointing fingers. There is only a spreading silence, just as the Pierce family had done. No lawsuits, no revenge, just allowing the truth to speak for itself. And that is the final touch that stirs the audience. You don't need to get angry to change everything. Just stand firm, hold on to your dignity, and let the truth speak. If this story made you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you dare to look at yourself before judging others? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to watch more stories that touch the heart, helping us all become better people, quietly yet powerfully. There are moments in life when you don't need to shout to prove what's right. Sometimes all you need to do is stand still and let the truth speak for itself. The story of Alexander Pierce's family at Sapphire Gate is a quiet yet powerful testament to this. When they were denied entry for no reason other than their appearance, without shouting, without anger, Alexander simply said, "I'll make a phone call." And that phone call overturned an entire system of flawed habits, exposing unconscious biases no one had ever dared to acknowledge. Genevieve Clark, once proud of her badge and uniform, was forced to confront a bitter lesson. Her greatest mistake wasn't just a wrong decision, but a long-standing habit of judgment she had never recognized. She learned from the Pierce family that true strength doesn't lie in wielding power to impose control, but in patience, self-respect, and in how one holds silence, letting dignity speak for itself. The lesson here isn't just for Genevieve, it's for all of us. In this noisy world, where everyone is quick to defend themselves, sometimes the most powerful thing isn't to speak out and protest, but to have the courage to stand still and trust that the truth will prevail. And it is that quiet strength, no matter how difficult, that touches the heart the most.